Hello and welcome. This is our sixth presentation in the virtual LRCCS Noon Lecture Series, Winter Term 2021. My name is Twyla Tardif, and I am Director of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies, and I am delighted to introduce our speaker for today's talk. The complete series schedule is available on the China Center's website, and email reminders go out weekly. So if you're not on our list, please feel free to email us and we will add you. At the end of today's presentation, we invite you to submit any questions you have for our speaker. We ask that you type your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I will read them and moderate them in a live format. We begin with an announcement. Our next presentation in the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies Noon Lecture Series will be held on February 23rd, and it will be given by Sheng Zhou, who is a postdoctoral fellow in the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies. He will be speaking about propaganda as viral stunts, how party press in China navigates between tradition and innovation. Today's presentation will be given by Yili Wu, Associate Professor in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at the Department of History at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Her research investigates the intersections of society, culture, and the body in the history of Chinese medicine, with special emphasis on the late imperial period. That's the 16th to 19th centuries. Her publications include Reproducing Women, Medicine, Metaphor, and Childbirth in Late Imperial China. That's from the University of California Press, put out in 2010, as well as many articles on medical illustration, forensic medicine, bone setting, breast cancer, and Chinese views of Western anatomical science. She is currently completing a new book manuscript on the history of traumatology in China. Today, she'll be speaking on myth-busting the history of Chinese medicine, going beyond the function, not structure, stereotype. Please join me in welcoming her.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, super. So thank you so much to everybody for coming. I have to admit to being a little intimidated. I see 122 participants and I can't see any of you, but thank you for being here. And thank you so much to the LRCCS for hosting me, and especially to Ina Schlorf and Keith Kudos for the great tech support and arrangements. So what I'm going to be talking about today is my forthcoming book. It has just completed peer review at Bergman Press, which is on the history of what I call injury medicine. And before I get started, just a quick warning and disclaimer. This is a medical history talk, so there may be some images that people find a little disturbing, just to know that they're coming. And also, I'm speaking historically, so none of the information here should be seen as an endorsement of any particular practices or practitioners. Now, in thinking about how I was going to boil down this book to talk to you guys today, I thought I would focus on two questions that are really driving my research. The first is, what kinds of techniques and ideas did people historically draw on to heal? And the second question is, what assumptions and biases do we, as scholars, as observers, bring to the study of them, the people who lived long in the past? And there are differences in different scholarly communities, and the particular biases that I'm going to be talking about today are really particular to Euro-American scholarship. And I want to say at the beginning that in Chinese language scholarship, there has been a lot written on the history of treating trauma and injury medicine, and much less so in the Euro-American Academy. And so one question I have then is, why do we focus on certain things and not on others? And here I have two illustrations that give a sense of the different kinds of things that one could talk about. On the left is a very typical illustration of a man showing the acupuncture tract on his arm. This is the lung acupuncture tract, which is something that has been studied extensively. And on the right, a picture of the skeleton, which is something that is largely absent from discussions of Chinese medicine in the Euro-American Academy. So I have three takeaway points that I'd like to leave you with today, and this is what I've structured my talk around. The first is that I want to talk about the need to differentiate between what one might call historical and traditional medicine. The title of my talk refers to a particular stereotype, the idea that Chinese medicine was interested in function but not in structure. And that, as I'll discuss, is a modern formulation, and it is limiting when we look at the historical background. So I want to make sure that we can differentiate between historical and so-called traditional medicine. The second thing I would like to do is to give you some sense of the ways in which historical injury medicine addressed the material and structural integrity of the body. So, the material forms of the body, the structural forms of the body are in fact very central to the treatment of injuries. And this is one of the things I'm looking at to try to break apart this stereotype that I mentioned at the beginning. And the third thing I'd like to do is to float a concept that I'm developing in my manuscript, which is that of what I call therapeutic morphology. And here, what I'm trying to do is to not use the word anatomy, which refers to knowledge of the body through dissection of dead bodies, but to find a way to talk about historical views of the body that don't always judge them according to how well they fit so called scientific anatomy. And so I'm using the word morphology to talk about the structure of the body. And I'm using the word therapeutic because for most of human history, when people dealt with the body, it was in a healing context. And what do you do when you are limited in your ability to see inside the body? What forms of the body become important in your calculations about what to do? So I want to introduce the idea of therapeutic morphology as a useful framework for talking about different approaches to the living body. And this image you can see here, this is from one of the texts that I analyzed in my book, and this is by an author named Hu Tingguang. And one of the things he did was to provide lots of illustrations of bone setting techniques. And this person in the middle, you can see he's in a bit of pain. They're trying to reset a dislocated shoulder here. So this kind of illustrates visually the point that injury medicine is really concerned with this structural and material body. So let me give you some details on these points. So, in my manuscript, I try to do what I call a social history of injury medicine. That this is a technology that developed to address medical issues, but these are medical issues with a lot of social significance. And here you can see a man with a multiple firing crossbow. So, of course, one of the places where this medicine is important is in military medicine and also in providing care for different parts of the government, the imperial family, officials, etc. It's also important because of the everyday accidents that people could have in home, during their occupation, in transportation, were real issues that could impair people's ability to have a livelihood, for example. And so it was important to be able to cure people. And finally, in China, for the period that I study, injury medicine has a lot of implications for law and order. So, for example, corporal punishment was a common form of a sentence for a crime. Judicial torture was also used. These were not supposed to kill people, but sometimes they could threaten people's lives. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that in Chinese law, inquests included inquests into wounded people. And if somebody was grievously wounded in an assault, their assailant would be responsible for their medical care during the so called responsibility period. And if that person were saved from dying, the assailant could avoid the capital charge of murder. So there are lots of social implications that make injury medicine very important. So just to give you a sense of excuse me, the kinds of conditions that I'm talking about. In medical texts, they talk about three main categories of injuries, so-called wounds from metal blades, so arrows, knives, swords, lances, that kind of thing. Injuries from falling and striking, so what we could think of as blunt trauma injuries, and falling from a height, as well as simply falling over. And you can see in this illustration, this poor gentleman on the left has fallen over and he can't get up. And on the right, a man being attacked by a wild beast. So we also have piercing and crushing injuries, burns and bites and stings, and also very important, what we would call sequelae, complications of injury, especially what in Chinese was called broken wind, or what we might call infection or even tetanus. And just to give you a sense of how universal some of these issues were, this is an illustration of a soldier suffering from tetanus, from an English surgeon, Sir Charles Bell. I don't have a Chinese image of it, but this was definitely a concern in texts. Now, I want to talk a little bit about differentiating between what I'm calling historical medicine and traditional medicine. So we know that historically there are many different kinds of practices that were used in healing and many different kinds of concerns that people addressed these therapies to. And what I want to underscore is that historically there are many treatments for acute, disabling, and fatal conditions. And in fact, if you look through standard historical books on medicine, you'll see that acute, disabling, and fatal conditions were very important, not least of which things like epidemic diseases, what we might think of as infectious diseases, strokes, all right, and also injuries. And we also know from the work of other historians and anthropologists that historically people expected the practitioner to cure them pretty quickly, right? They didn't have the patience for a long treatment. They wanted to get better quickly. Now, what happened is that beginning, especially in the early 20th century, the people who practiced these different techniques needed to survive in a world that was increasingly dominated by biomedicine and the knowledge structures of biomedicine. And so, among the things they did was to adopt biomedical models and institutions, professional associations, journals, um, scientific models of testing and efficacy. But at the same time, what they did was to efface certain aspects of the historical uh, repertoire that no longer seemed legitimate vis-a-vis Western medical science. And among the other things they did in trying to find a space for themselves in a biomedical world was to create this idea that Chinese medicine was holistic. And this is a term that did not historically exist. And so what we have then is the development of so-called traditional medicine, and you need to have an idea of modernity if you want to have a traditional medicine. And this term is Kim Taylor has determined first appeared in a journal written in English addressed to an international audience. And the Chinese government that established the PRC in 1949 also very actively and intentionally sought to develop historical practices as to synthesize it with Western medicine. And that provided the foundation for many of the so-called complementary and alternative therapies based on Chinese medical ideas that you see in the picture below. This is James Harrison of the New England Patriots using cupping and acupuncture for recovery from different kinds of physical stress and injuries. So this is what I say when we want to differentiate between historical and traditional medicine, because as traditional medicine was created, there were certain models, okay, and values that emerged as part of this adaptation and modernization. And what happened is that some of these things got projected back on the historical record and obscured some of the distinctive aspects of historical medicine. So just to give you a couple of very quick quotations so you understand how this was done. When Western medicine initially started to circulate in China, Tang Songhai, a very famous Chinese doctor who preached using Western and Chinese medicine ideas together, felt that Western anatomical studies could clarify things about the Chinese medical body. And his formulation was to say that Western medicine is good at visible configurations. Chinese medicine is good at qi transformation, or qi being the vital material force. And we can combine them together to benefit from the strengths of both. But by the early 20th century, you have this idea emerging that Chinese medicine, many aspects of it are no longer tenable. And the Dr. Yun Tietjiao said the five organs that our medical texts talk about are not actually the organs of flesh and blood, but the organs of the four seasonal transformations. So you can see this effacement of the material body. And here I want to give a shout out to Sean Lay and Volker Scheid, whose work I've summarized here. Be very interested. They have written much more extensively about this. But essentially, the idea is that the material body becomes erased or effaced from the historical record. And this is where we have then the so-called, what I'm calling the function, not structure stereotype, that despite the fact that you have many instances of people thinking about bodily components, when this modernized form of Chinese medicine gets disseminated, you have interpretations like this very typical one from Manfred Porkert, who is a very influential interpreter, who says that Chinese medicine doesn't have organs, but only orbs of function. So he says, for example, the Chinese word fei for lungs calls to mind only coincidentally and vaguely most of the ideas someone with a Western education associates with the lungs. Instead, Fei designates primarily and predominantly an orb of functions, the orbis pulmonalis. All right. So what I'm trying to do then, to move on to my second takeaway here, is to recover historical structure and materiality in the way people thought about the body, and using injury medicine as a way to do this, because injury medicine is all about damage to the material structures of the body. So just to give you an example, one of the things that my texts talk about are so-called abdominal injuries with intestinal protrusion. The intestines come out of the body. And an early record of this talks even about sewing together the ends of an intestine that has become severed. And here's a quotation that I find particularly evocative. He says, use a needle and thread to rejoin the severed intestine according to the standard method. Then daub chicken blood on the seam, then push it back into the body. So, what is the standard method? Well, he doesn't really say, but it's clear that there was a whole realm of practice that sometimes would make it into texts, right? But it was a form of practice that was assumed to be efficacious and that had developed to address these very dangerous injuries. A slightly more detailed description appears in a text of 1337 by a doctor from a hereditary medical family where generations had practiced medicine. And here the author, Wei Yilin, explains, use a strand of hemp as a thread or pound the skin of mulberry root into a thread. Also, coat the thread with powdered ophicalcite, which is a form of limestone. One must sew the belly skin from the interior layer. One must not sew the outer layer of skin, but leave the outer skin open. Apply drugs to it and wait for the flesh to grow back. And the idea is you don't want to close up the wound entirely because you might create an abscess that would be very lethal. Now, in thinking about the relationship between structure and function, which I think are really allied in the historical context, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is the way in which observed transformations of material substances provide the basis for theorizing function. And some of you may have done as I did, gotten butterflies for your children to raise. And it is quite a miraculous thing when you think about it to watch a caterpillar transform into a butterfly. And these kinds of changes in material substance, then you can see provide a very rich substrate for theorizing function. Now I'm going to show you a much less pleasant picture, which is that one of the main concerns in injury medicine is how to, what they say, grow back flesh and close up the wound opening. And here you have an image from a modern medical paper where they show you the transformation of something from injured flesh to intact flesh. And I find this also very evocative, that as doctors were treating a very basic problem, they were in this feedback loop between watching the transformation of skin and flesh, right? And thinking about the things that would help that along. Now, this treatment of damaged flesh is very, very central in injury medicine. And I just want to give you an example from one of the texts that I'm looking at. I previously mentioned that corporal punishment was a major source of injury. And so Shweji, the doctor, is talking about his patient, and he says there was a patient who had suffered overly heavy corporal punishment. His skin was injured and broken, and stagnant blood poured out. Beneath it, his flesh was rotting away. So here's somebody with a very grievous wound. And the question is, how do you restore him to wholeness? How do you perform a restoration of the structural and material integrity of his body? And in addition to this physical damage, he also has a lot of complications. Shweji continues, there was a deep black swelling that extended upwards through his chest and back and downward through his toes. He was in a stupor and not able to take any food. So Shweji uses a combination of different therapies that again are very typical of injury medicine. He uses internally or ingested drugs, so he gives them medicinal potions. He washes the surface with medicinal washes. He uses a lancet to cut away rotting flesh. He uses external topical poultices and things to help this person back to health. Another example of the kinds of things that people could do, of course, you have wounds that need to be taken care of, and you also have wounds that you need to repair and then take care of. And this is a case from one of my authors, Hu Jingguang. We saw his image in the beginning of the man getting his shoulder set. And here he's talking about a patient of his who was very badly injured in a drunken brawl. So this poor man, his scrotum was torn in pieces and kind of, I think, not unexpected injury if you're in a barroom brawl. And his two testicles hung down in the crotch of his trousers. I held up his testicles inside the scrotum and used a thread made from the fine fibers of white mulberry bark to sew the skin together and dusted it with ophicalcite powder. And here this should sound a little familiar. We saw some of the same techniques being used to sew together intestines. But then, unfortunately, this man, he got careless and he got angry. And anger is one of these things that causes a lot of complications, both after injury and in life in general. So he got angry, causing bulging and distension so that the testicles fell out again. Basically, the wound opened up. Medicinal water was used to wash away the pus and the filth, but the sutured places were all already rotten and there was nothing more that could be sewn up. So now what do you do? So ingeniously, who remembers something that he read in a medical text? And what he does is he uses spider webs as an artificial membrane. And he said, I had someone again hold up the testicles and seek out wall spider webs. I applied them layer by layer and dusted the injury with drugs to grow flesh and close up the wound opening, which we saw before. And after 2 months of regulation, he recovered. All right. So again, this very intense engagement with structural and material damage to the body and thinking about how to make someone whole again, um, both with structural repair and with functional regulation. So structure and function are not opposed, but go together hand in hand. All right, so that was my second point about the different ways in which injury medicine deals with that structural and material realities of the body. And my third takeaway point is to talk about therapeutic morphology. And to do that, I'd like to talk a little bit about bone setting, which occupies a chapter in my book. So I'd like to talk about this through three texts. And the first and earliest is a text compiled by the Imperial Medical Bureau. the so-called imperially commissioned golden mirror of the medical lineage. And here is an image from that, which I'll talk a bit about just very shortly. But essentially, it's an image showing from the external side of the body um, all the different bones that we might find on the chest. Okay, so they divide the body into regions, each of which is distinguished by certain bony features. Now, as I'll mention, there are certain lacuna in this text, and there are two authors which try to improve on this by incorporating the skeleton text that we saw at the beginning, incorporating additional information on bones that they thought that had been left out of the imperial text. And the two texts that I look at in my book are one by a man named Qian Xiuchang, who is a expert in the treatment of traumatic ailments, and Hu Tingguang, who we've already met. And both of them incorporated this skeleton image, which actually comes from forensics, into their text on traumatology. And so we'll look at why. So in the Golden Mirror, uh, it is they have many chapters on different subfields of illness, and the last four chapters are dedicated to the topic of what the imperial compilers called rectifying bones. And a major aim of this curriculum of rectifying bones is to prevent disability. And they say explicitly, if you want to prevent disability from someone who has suffered a broken bone, there are certain kinds of knowledge that you need to know. And what they do in this text is to elevate manual knowledge, right? And historically, in the hierarchy of value, intellectual knowledge was valued above manual therapy. But here, the compilers elevate manual therapy and say that the ability to use one's hands in a perspicacious way is the mark of an excellent healer. And so, in addition to outlining various manual methods for restoring the shape, form, and positions of bones that have been broken or dislocated, they also um, describe many orthopedic implements that should be used to fix the bones in place and ensure their healing. And I just wanted to introduce you to some of these. And these images are quite unprecedented in the literature. One of the features of the Golden Mirror is it has a very extensive repertoire of illustrations. And so here you see on the left-hand side something I've translated Tongmu as the perforated board, and they provide detailed explanations on how to make this thing, how to bore the holes, how to shape out a channel in the middle to place over the backbone. And the idea is that after you straighten out the spine of somebody who's had an injury, you place this on as a brace and you strap it on. On the right-hand side, this is one of my favorite images, actually, and I always show it to my students without any caption, and people assume it's some sort of a torture implement, and maybe it was. I'm sure it was quite painful to use, but actually, what he's doing is he's holding on to ropes suspended from this A-frame and standing on a stack of bricks. And slowly they remove one brick at a time until the person's body weight allows them to straighten their back. So these are some of the things that they would be doing to restore structural integrity to the body and allow the body to heal properly. And in bone setting texts and treatises throughout the historical period, a major concern is if you don't set the bone properly, right, you will end up with a disability. The person will not be able to use their body correctly again. Just to give you some more examples of the kinds of orthopedic implements that they used and the different things they were interested in, on the left, you have what I've translated as the knee encircler. So this is a ring of flexible bamboo that would be attached to the knee after a dislocated kneecap was set. On the right, you have what would be used to splint a long bone. So the bones of the arm, bones of the legs, um, what they call the bamboo screen and the fur fence. The bamboo screen, you can see it's there. it looks like a sushi roller, or something you use to roll up sushi, and that's very much what it was. And then the fur fence is stiffer, thicker boards of wood that are put around that initial um, screen to immobilize the arm. And one of the things too that they worry about in these bone setting texts, thinking about the relation between function and structure, is that you had to be sure that while you were stabilizing the bones, you didn't make it overly stiff. All right, because if you made it overly stiff, the tendons and things would seize up, and again, that would impair their function. So there's a lot of discussion about how to set the bones in different parts of the body so that you could avoid creating new problems as the injured part healed. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Golden Mirror is interested in mapping out the body into different sections and telling you what kinds of injuries and bones are found in each section. And it has to be said that when compared to other bone setting texts, the Golden Mirror was not necessarily the most detailed. In fact, there were other texts that were far more detailed. And the argument that I'm making is that its main contribution is to create a regional map of the body, to take all these other writings and to systematize them and to organize this knowledge by body region. And so the way that this discussion is structured in the Golden Mirrors chapters on bone setting is that they would start with an illustration of a particular part of the body. And you can see here on the far left of your screen, this is the section that talks about the bones of the face. And then under that section, you would have a discussion of what bones were there, what the different names were used for that bone, what the standard name should be, and what some of the typical injuries were. And this mapping of the body was done because it was believed that you had to understand the layout of these things if you're going to cure them. Properly, no surprise there. But the Golden Mirror explicitly said that when it comes to the bones of the body, their physical forms are not all the same. Therefore, it is essential to have prior knowledge of their forms and recognize their relative positions. So we need to understand the morphology of these bones, where they're laid out, all right, in order to carry out our therapy. And you can see in the middle picture here, I particularly like this one showing the back of the head. It also shows you the different names for the first three vertebrae in the neck. And the image on the far right is an image of the different bones of the leg. And again, you can see this is viewing the body from the outside. What would the healer be seeing and feeling and looking for? Now, for modern eyes, we look at these images and we think, we're looking for more anatomical specificity. And one of the arguments that I make is that there's a whole body of manual knowledge, of tactile knowledge that resides outside of the text, and that these images would be used as a guide. As a mnemonic, as a way to absorb this information, but they were not supposed to stand in directly, right, for the eye in the way that the anatomical illustrations that we're more accustomed to might do. So let me give you an example of the kind of lacuna that arise from this kind of presentation. So here's the Golden Mirror's discussion of what they call the B bone, and I've circled it in red on this illustration here, which is an illustration of the bones of the arm. And you can see from this that the details are contained in the textual description. So it says the B bone, going from the elbow and ending at the wrist, there are two long pieces of bone, one main and one auxiliary. The one that lies beneath, which is long and large in shape and connected to the point of the elbow, is the B bone, or biomedical ulna. The one that lies above, which is short and thin in shape, is the auxiliary bone, or the biomedical radius. Its common name is the wrapping around bone. They sit evenly matched one upon the other and rely on each other, and both connect below to the wrist bone. So here you see a discrepancy between the illustration, which just has one name and suggests one bone, All right, and the description, which gives you a far more detailed differentiation between the two bones in the forearm, and in fact applies this term only to the larger bone, which says lies beneath. So it was this kind of lacuna that Chen Xiaochang and Hu Tingguang tried to address in their books. And what they did was to add inquest forms to the medical texts. And as Chen Xiaochang explained, when someone has a dislocated or fractured bone, the bone and joint are wrapped in flesh. Looking at it from the exterior, it is hard to get a clear understanding, and there is the danger of making an error. Now, I write extensively and I have published work on these particular forms. And what I find particularly fascinating is that there is this sort of circular relationship between information about bones that arises in the medical context and information about bones that arises in the forensic context. And the origin of these illustrations, as some of you in the audience may already know, is that in the early 18th century, the Qing government was standardizing the death investigation forms that they were using throughout the empire. And eventually, an official complained that these forms were not very useful for reporting injuries found on bony remains. And so the government subsequently issued these charts of the bones of the body, from viewed from the front and viewed from the back, where injuries might be found on postmortem remains, and which officials would use to fill out their inquest forms. Now, again, to the modern eyes, there are many things in these illustrations that are not anatomically correct. Um, so my view of this is, if we can bracket the issue of anatomical correctness, we're left with the very real phenomenon that people were thinking actively about the structure of the body and trying to augment their knowledge about the structure of the body in order to carry out therapy better. And I think this is important to note, given the stereotype that I mentioned at the beginning, that structure was not relevant to therapy. And I think it's very clear that it was. Now, having said that, I should also add as a side note that the officials who had to use these forms to do their inquest reports complained from the very beginning that there are many inaccuracies. And we do find people trying to improve this as time goes on. But what I just want to place here is the idea that these doctors who are treating traumatic illnesses are continually looking for ways to increase the knowledge that is in circulation, looking for better models, and continually reiterating that a knowledge of structure is essential for proper therapy. And in the case of bone setting, um, to allow the healer to restore full function to the patient. Okay, and I see it's 12:40, and I'm so proud of myself because I'm doing really well on time. And so I want to move then to wrapping this up so we have plenty of time for Q&A. So I have some concluding thoughts then. What I've tried to do in our time together is to give you a sense that if we're going to historicize medicine, and in particular Chinese medicine, we need to explore all facets of the body's history. And here I want to just confess that I was a little punch happy when Ina asked me for the title to this talk. So I guess myth busting is a little bit provocative and I mean perhaps a little aggressive, but I do really feel that what I've been trying to do is say we need to look beyond these stereotypes and we need to see what are people actually saying and doing. And I have another article in which I look at how they view organs and how Chinese doctors are very interested in the relative positions of the organs. And that's why they were interested in Western anatomical texts when those started circulating in the 19th century. So historicizing medicine means that we need to explore all facets of the body's history. And in order to do that, we need to understand what stereotypes we may be bringing to the kinds of questions that we ask about our historical materials. And then once we better understand what people used to be doing, then we can better understand how historical ideas have been transformed for present day use. And I mentioned earlier that so called traditional Chinese medicine and its many variants are an important form of complementary and alternative medicine today. And you may know that there are lots of different um, stereotypes and myths from the idea that, well, it's all quackery and it's all based on superstition and the placebo effect, right? To the other end of the spectrum, which is that, well, this is ancient knowledge that has been tested over the centuries. Um, and in order to sort through these different assessments, I think it's important to realize that these ideas evolved in a historical context where people were living with the material effects of illnesses, where their bodies were being structurally damaged, where they were dealing with acute and life threatening conditions, and that they, just as we are, were doing the best with the resources they had at hand to try to keep people from dying and to try to keep people from being maimed or impaired by their maladies. And so, with this history in mind, then, we can better understand how we might assess some of the claims and things that people are using today. And the last thing I want to leave you with is that I'm expecting that I'll be able to get my book out by next year. But if anybody wants to read anything more right now, I just want to give a shout out to some of the modern translators who are writing about the use of different aspects of injury medicine. A couple of books translated by Lorraine Wilcox, including the Xueji text that I discussed with the beating case, the flogging case, um, and martial artists as well are using different therapies drawn from injury medicine to treat the injuries of martial arts. And actually, martial arts was also an important arena in which injury medicine developed historically. And for those who can read Chinese, there is a vast literature in Chinese documenting the different techniques that people used over time. So I will stop there. And I think now is when I stop sharing my screen. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts on any or all of this. So thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Sheely. I'm going to stop my video so we can hear. Just really fascinating to hear the, in some ways, the modernity of the approaches to dealing with some of the injuries with, not all of the fancy x-rays, et cetera. So I am going to start with a question by Grace Dwyer, who asks, in the grab ropes and stack bricks treatment, how long did the entire process normally take?
I don't know. It doesn't actually say. It tells you how to use it. And I think this is a good case where what they're trying to do is set up a standard, right, of care, that here are the things that you would use, here's some of the standard equipment that you would need. And then as people were learning to use these things, right, you would have a more experienced practitioner showing you how to adjust that therapy to the particular patient who was undergoing it. But that's a really excellent question. There's a lot of stuff that is outside the written record that we just have to discern as best as we can. But there are obviously historical limitations on that. Thank you, Grace.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, I think that current day approaches to traction would be similar. Don't know. Depends. So Joan Judge says, thank you for this fabulous talk and introduction to your forthcoming book. I have one question about what you consider to be the effacement of materiality with the advent of biomedicine from the turn of the 20th century. In some instances, it seems that Chinese medicine is more materially focused than Western medicine. So for example, Western medicine focuses on the invisible germ, while Chinese medicine focuses on treating highly specific physical symptoms. So cramps, vomiting, etc. How does this fit into your schema?
So I actually have thought a lot about things like vomiting and diarrhea and the material. effects of illness. And I think that it definitely is part of my schema, and it's one of the things that I was thinking about, right, when I was thinking about material and structure. Um, and it's not just Chinese medicine. I think before germ theory, right, so-called Western medicine is also really focused on alleviating symptoms and judging somebody's illness by the kinds of things that come out of their body. One thing I will say very quickly in terms of infectious diseases, and I've written about this elsewhere, is that Chinese doctors also thought about pathogens, right, invading the body, pathogens that you couldn't see that would then create material perturbations. And one of the things they were very interested in is to understand the physical pathways through which these pathogens would enter the body and where they might form blockages that would then produce these kinds of symptoms. So definitely the symptomology of infectious diseases and the materially observable phenomena that they would produce, that is completely linked to interest in the structure of the body.
Great, thank you. So this is a question from Michael Fetters, who says, fascinating work, congratulations, and asks, to what extent do you find evidence for specialization in historic and traditional Chinese medicine? So the tradition of general practice versus specialist practice, bone setting as analogous to orthopedics versus things like doctors using herbs and minerals instead of setting bones. And his
Right.
understanding is that modern traditional Chinese medicine hospitals have many or Western-based medical departments and technology. And so he's interested in the roots and trends or changes over time for specialization in historical or traditional Chinese medicine.
Um, that's a great question. So I mentioned the golden mirror of medicine, and um, that was divided up into different categories, different subspecialties that corresponded to the different divisions in the Imperial Medical Academy. And specialization is present in Chinese medicine from very early on. All the government bureaus are specialized either according to the population. So you had departments of children's medicine or women's medicine, um, or according to the specific malady. So you have epidemic febrile diseases or cold damage in the Chinese terminology. You have departments of pox and rashes. You have departments of injuries. And the short answer to your question about how that is carried down to the modern day is you still have these specialist labels, even in hospitals where they have departments of Western medicine. But what you find is that the kinds of things that they treat are different. So, for example, historically, right, a expert in trauma medicine would also do various kinds of suturing and surgery. And now that kind of surgery would be done in the Western setting, but you might still have people using traditional methods to deal with sprains or rehabilitation, or using topical herbs to heal. So the content has changed, but the labels are still very important in terms of organizing medical knowledge.
Thank you. Andrea Baladon, and I apologize if I mispronounced. She says, interestingly, before you said that some of the images were about mapping the body, and they remind her of maps she's been looking at for imperial capitals. And the way they represent space and structures is different about how we think about maps now. So what relationships do you see between ways of thinking about representing space and ways of thinking about and representing the body?
So that is a huge question. So I'm going to say, first of all, that Shigehisa Koriyama has written directly about organ maps and Chinese maps. So if you want to email me, I can look up that resource source citation for you. And there's also a huge body of literature on the way in which different styles of anatomical illustration think about space and depth. Um, I It's a huge question. So I think basically that that is something that needs a lot more investigation, and it really goes down to what is an image for, right? What is an image for? And one of the things that people have said about European anatomical drawings is they have depth. And you have the sense that you are opening up the body and entering into the body and basically replicating the eye of the dissector, right? And that one of the things you see in these Chinese illustrations is that everything's there, right? So the skin is peeled away, and there isn't the sense of opening up the body, and that you know, there's issues of perspective and depth that are not there. Um, I think I will stop there and just say that it's a huge question, and people in art history have also talked about, the way in which space is represented in Chinese art. And I can't really do justice to your question, but it's absolutely very important. So thank you very much for bringing up this issue of how different kinds of visual representations influence each other and are part of a larger iconographic tradition.
Great. All right, so Yiming Wang says, thank you for this interesting talk, and is wondering whether the medical theory after the late Ming period was influenced in any way by Jesuit missionaries and the knowledge that they brought.
Right. So the Jesuit missionaries definitely brought in anatomical texts. And I think it's important to note that what we think of as Western medicine has really changed a lot over time, too. Right now we talk about Western medicine and we use that really as a synonym for biomedicine, right? But if you look at Jesuit medicine in the time of the Jesuits, right, humoral medicine is still very important, right? Thinking about how the alignment of the planets affected the human body is still very important, right, in European medicine. And so what we find is that the Jesuits were valued by, for example, the Kangxi Emperor for some of the new drugs that they brought in that the Chinese could fit into their existing patterns of drug use. There was quite a lot of interest in anatomical treatises, again, because there were already Chinese doctors interested in the layout of the body and the different organs of the body. Um, so the short answer is yes, but the number of Jesuits and the circulating of their texts was very small compared to the vast empire, and so it's really only in the latter part of the 19th century, with a much larger influx of Protestant missionaries and also modernizing movements by Chinese elites themselves, that you have a much broader spread of these ideas at a time, by the way, when Western medicine is shifting over to germ theory and enjoying some of its greatest triumphs, such as in vaccination and antiseptic abdominal surgery.
Um, wow, we have a lot of questions here. I'm going to, I think we have time for one, maybe two more. Could you talk a little bit? This is from Xiaowen Cheng. Could you talk a little bit about the social aspect of injury medicine?
Right. So what I'm trying to do is really to think about the um, social context in which medicine was used, right? And the reason I brought up this issue is because I wanted to emphasize, right, that this is a really important thing that people are using. So, for example, one of the things I talk about is the desire to avoid disability. All right, and disability in Imperial China has a very specific connotation because it's a legal status that you can have. And it's actually a legal tax status, so that if you are someone who is considered to be disabled, for example, you are not obligated to provide corvée labor. If you are somebody who is considered disabled, you are subject to lighter penalties in the case of crime, for example, and you might also get stipends from the state. Um, and in thinking about, the implications of what it means to be injured and not to recover fully in a society where manual labor is still very important, right? I think really underscores for me um, the fact that this isn't just some sort of thing that people are doing outside of what we think of Chinese medicine, right? So people are kind of doing herbs and they're doing acupuncture and oh yeah, and some people are also doing injury medicine. What I want to do is say this is a very socially important thing because it really has implications for how people live their lives. And so we really need to integrate it back into the history of Chinese medicine. Um, and to also think about the ways in which an injury is not just something that influences one person's body, it influences their family. It influences whether their assailant is going to be charged with murder and whether the magistrate now has to carry out a very difficult murder investigation and compile all these files. Um, and it determines whether soldiers will willingly fight, right, if they think they're going to be taken care of when they're injured. Um, so it has a lot of broader implications beyond just the body of one person.
Wonderful. Okay, I think we have time for one very short one. Can you talk a little bit about how tactile knowledge was handed over to others?
Right. Um, I think it's pretty well, accepted that a lot of medical knowledge of all sorts was taught from person to person. And in fact, certain kinds of knowledge can only be taught from person to person. Um, One of the things I talk about in my book is suturing. And I don't know how many of you, when I was a kid, we were all taught in school how to sew on a button and how to hem a hem. Simply sewing cloth with a needle and thread takes a certain amount of tactile skill and motor control. Now, think about sewing a living human being. All right. And even today in medical schools, right, in our modern medical schools, students have to practice. And the difference between an experienced surgeon and a novice medical student sewing up a wound is vast in terms of their time and efficacy. So it's clear they would have been taught by more experienced practitioners. Um, I don't know, how much they experimented on people. Certainly, they would have had training exercises. So one of the bone setters that I look at in my book, they say that he used to train his students' sense of touch by taking a writing brush. So scholars in China wrote with a brush made of a bamboo shaft. Okay, he would break the writing brush up, put it inside a paper bag, and have the students manipulate the pieces of that brush until they could join up all the ends together. Okay, so there was clearly a lot of training going on to cultivate people's senses of touch.
Well, thank you very, very much. There unfortunately are many more questions that got asked than the ones that you were able to answer. And I hope that those of you who would like to follow up will contact Professor Wu directly. And thank you to everybody for joining us today. And,
Thanks, everybody.
and especially to you, Ely. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.